is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu, chapters 1 and 2. In these first two chapters, we get dropped into an unfamiliar world where a really horrific sounding war ended a little over a decade ago. Some people have forgotten about it. Some people have not. Welcome to Spoil Me. All right, welcome to the show, everybody. My name is Natasha. Many thanks to Kyle Summers for commissioning this episode. This is, everything that I have covered so far has been, obviously, everything's been different. But this is, I think, the first really intense, classic fantasy that I've seen so far. And it's really taking adjustment for me to get into that sort of storytelling style and learning a whole slew of names that I'm not familiar with, place names that I'm not familiar with. It's just, it's really kind of funny to me because I started Unspoiled covering Song of Ice and Fire, and that is still something that I kind of view as a flagship show. And this is so far, in many ways, pretty similar. Not, story or plot-wise or anything, but I mean in terms of a complete invented world and politics and all of this. And I'm realizing just how little of that I've encountered in other properties that I've covered outside of Song of Ice and Fire. So I, first of all, want to mention I'm covering the first two chapters of this, which adds up to part 1, because it was very unclear on the Kindle version which, how many pages things were. So, Kyle, if you are wanting me to stop in a specific spot, if there's at some point you commission another episode and you want to tell me specifically how far to read, I'm fine with that, because I had to sort of estimate here, and normally the Kindle version is there's a number, it has two options. You can either go to position or pages. And I've been using pages for most of these recordings in order to get a closer estimation. And for some reason, this book doesn't have that option. It's only position. So the first page of the actual story was position 163. So that's not a super useful metric. So yeah, I decided to do the first two chapters because I felt like that was a good natural ending point to get things rolling, because there's so much of the world building and setup here that I felt I was going to have plenty to talk about for an hour. So I just didn't want to overdo it. I had that same problem. I'll try to be more specific about. Oh, it's not on you at all. But if you, doing Sunshine, for example, there were specific places that I know the girl commissioning it, Rosalie, had wanted me to stop at because she wanted a live read for this next part, or she felt like this part was. So, just if there's something that you're really particular about, then just let me know and I'll do that. To start off, the first part is called All Under Heaven. Chapter 1. An Assassin. Okay, hi. It's literally titled Chapter 1. An Assassin. Did I see this coming? No, I did not, because I'm an idiot who does not pay attention. I had this happen on fucking Doctor Who last week. The episode is called Dalek. And yet when the big reveal that there's something hidden somewhere and nobody knows what it is and it's a Dalek, I'm just like, oh shit, a Dalek! That's the name of the episode, Natasha. What are you doing? No, people call me smart sometimes, and I really wonder. Zudi, the 7th month, in the 14th year of the reign of one bright heaven. So I'm feeling like when we read the title of these, because it says the 14th year of the reign of one bright heaven, reign of one bright heaven is what we call this overarching kingdom. Because the war was basically a takeover. There had been lots of little provinces called states that were all seen as equal and self-governing. And then there was a revolution takeover situation, and one of those states overpowered all the others. And now everybody is ruled under one emperor, which is not how shit used to be only 14 years ago. So this chapter starts off with a sort of, it's a parade, but it's also like a reminder to everyone that like, oh, hey, I'm still in charge. And the emperor is visiting all of these different states and different areas within them in order to show himself and display his wealth and power and whatnot. And it's really atmospheric. So I'm going to read this. The first sentence, the fucking thing, it's called An Assassin. And then the first sentence is, a white bird hung still in the clear western sky and flapped its wings sporadically. Yeah. First chapter, first page, first line, and yet I still didn't see. So in this fantasy land, it's in some ways different than some heavy like classic fantasy, because there are airships here. So there's like a kind of conflation of periods happening. They had gasped in awe as a fleet of giant imperial airships passed overhead, shifting gracefully from one elegant formation to another. They had gawped in respectful silence as the heavy battle carts rolled before them, thick bundles of ox sinew draping from the stone-throwing arms. They had praised the emperor's foresight and generosity as his engineers sprayed the crowd with perfumed water from ice wagons, cool and refreshing in the hot sun and dusty air of northern Kokru. They had clapped and cheered the best dancers the six conquered Tiro states had to offer. 500 Fossa maidens who gyrated seductively in the veil dance, a sight once reserved for the royal court in Boama. 400 Kokru sword twirlers who spun their blades into bright chrysanthemums of cold light that melted martial glory with lyrical grace. Dozens of elegant, stately elephants from wild, sparsely settled Ikofi Island, painted with the colors of the 7 states, the largest male draped in the white flag of Zana, as one would expect, while the others wore the rainbow colors of the conquered lands. Just so you know, almost all of what I just read is one sentence. I think there's like 4 periods at the start of it, like 3 maybe, and then there's a lot of semicolons, and it's all one sentence. This is the one gripe I'm having about the writing so far, is that the sentences are unnecessarily long. You could easily break these up and make this a little bit more rhythmic. While I'm reading it out loud, I'm able to inflect it and give it some rhythm. But when you're reading it from the page, it's difficult to sort of like let your mind absorb because, you know, you read in a certain rhythm. Once you hit a period, you let your brain absorb what was before that period in a way. And if you keep getting semicolons, you keep thinking, okay, I can't quite relax and absorb this yet because there's another thing right here. And there's so many in a row. And there's another, like, there's one even more intense a little bit later that I'll point out. But I did really like this sets up so much of what this place looks like, the you know, implicit culture. The fact that Zana is draped over like the largest male, and then the rainbow colors are over the conquered land. So Zana is clearly like the most important. The other lands have been conquered. The fact that it's draped over the largest male implies that this is probably like a more patriarchal system that values masculinity. And the fact that these are elephants and like veil dancers and everything suggests some place that's like in Middle Asia. And yeah, it's just really like puts a lot out there. And there's a sentence that I'm still curious about because I don't think we get an answer to this right away. Like, and by right away, I mean in these 2 chapters that I read so far. The elephants pulled a moving platform on which stood 200 of the best singers all the islands of Dara had to offer, a choir whose existence would have been impossible before the Zana conquest. So I think it's not directly said, but I guess what the implication is here is that all of the islands offered their best, which is just, it's not like impossible, like, oh, this could never have existed. It's simply that was not something that the islands did, was work together and pool their people. Everything was very separate. And so this choir would not have existed. But reading this the first time, I didn't really understand what that sentence was saying until I got a little bit further on and found out exactly what happened. So there's all of these, like different, like songs and poems that are sung about the conquest essentially, and the mighty reign and beauty of the, different states and all of the like strength of their ruler. And it's really weird when you find out how recent this war is. If the servile words bothered those in this Kokru crowd who had probably taken up arms against the Zana invaders scarcely more than a dozen years ago, any mutterings were drowned out by the full-throated, frenzied singing of the men and women around them. The hypnotic chant held a power of its own, as if by mere repetition the words gained weight, became more true. So this is one of those things that I really understand a little bit better as an adult. Because I know that as a kid, if I had read this, like more than a dozen years ago when you're young feels like forever ago. And as you get older, obviously, you start to realize like how that's nothing. It's nothing. Like to me, 1998 was like 6 or 7 years ago in my head. And the fact that these people have moved on, it's a symptom of a couple things. Like they're cheering this crowd, this parade that represents everything that they were fighting against, which on the one hand is a little despicable and like sad. On the other hand, it's also a function of like oppressed peoples who have to cope with what they have, right? Like how long can you sustain your rage and desire for like vengeance against something that is implacable? And I think that's where a lot of us are right now, is feeling really beaten down, and we're angry and we want change and we want to do a lot. But like when you have as much bad news coming at you all the time as we've had lately, you have to become so much more selective about what you are going to expend your energy on. And these people in this crowd are probably just, struggling to get by every day. And when it comes right down to it, I don't know how much difference there is to the average person between what it was like to live under the one state and what it is like now to live under the grouping of states as like a United States. So I'm very curious about that, because the story that we hear later is told from the point of view of somebody who really had a lot to lose. It was a family who was wealthy, who had a lot of social standing, and just when things changed for them, it really changed. And their legacy as a family would never be the same. But what is it like for the people who did not have a legacy like this to worry about? That's my question is, okay, you may have rage against these people for conquering you. How much of that rage is just like your pride and anger, and how much of that is about the way that they're doing things? Like, because there's not a lot yet to make me feel one way or another. That's not to say that there aren't a couple things mentioned that are really horrible, which I will talk about. But yeah, so this white bird, by the way, is still around. Its wings seem to be as wide and long as the spinning vanes of the windmills in Zudi that drew water from deep wells and piped it into the houses of the wealthy. Too big to be an ordinary eagle or vulture. So still, this thing is coming at him, and there's this really funny moment to me. It's funny, where we get the point of view of the emperor himself, and we get to see how incredibly bored he is. And I really wonder what people who want to conquer lands are looking for as like an end game. Because it seems like when we're in his point of view, the thing that like seems to bum him out is that there is no... he wept for there were no more worlds to conquer kind of thing. Like, I guess you think that the adoration and fealty of like, 7 times as many states as what you originally had would be a real high that you would be excited about. But it seems like that's not satisfying anymore. And instead, there's a comment about how much it all sounds the same. And like he has seen the same sort of play or pantomime, 30 or 40 times at this point. So, I do not feel bad at all for the emperor. Don't get me wrong. But I did find it funny how like totally unimpressed he is, and how he's not up there on this like litter relishing the attention that he's getting. That's not happening at all, which is really what you'd think. That he'd be looking down and, yes, that's right, you. Either he'd be like, I'm better than you, or he'd be like, maybe contemptuous of the fact that they had taken up arms against him and now they were worshiping him in this way. Or he'd be, it depends on whether he's a good guy or a bad guy. Is he thinking about what he can do for these people? Is he like thinking about how much he's going to fuck over these people and how he's looking forward to it? But there's none of that. It's just him being bored, which says plenty about who he is in and of itself. He's very self-absorbed. He's not thinking about what he can do for them. He doesn't have any goals now. It seems very much like he just had a super short-term plan that wasn't well thought out. And then he got that, it's like a dog chasing a car. I don't know what I'd do with one if I got it. So I found that sort of like fascinating and really unexpected. It's also unexpected to see things from the point of view of a person who is, I don't even want to say the big bad, even though for some people he is, but just representative of the absolute pinnacle of power. That's not unheard of at all, but it's certainly not that common. And most of the time when we do see from that perspective in other books, it's pretty fascinating. There's a lot going on with that person. So it's a combination of not expecting to see things through his eyes at all. And then when I do, it's just nothing. All right, let's talk about Kuni and Rin. Kuni is he's a Gryffindor. He's an impetuous kid who solves things without really thinking it through. He's pretty pushy. He's pretty strong and really proactive. And then there's Rin, who still not quite sure on Rin. Could be a Hufflepuff. Could be one of those low-key hanging back kind of Gryffindors who just, occasionally pulls one out and you're just like, oh, there it is. But Rin is essentially like his nerdy friend who is much more concerned about breaking the rules, getting in trouble, eating peanuts because he's got an allergy. That doesn't actually come up, but it feels like the kind of thing that would come up. And Rin keeps on saying things to Kuni about like, this isn't a good idea. We shouldn't be standing here. We shouldn't be going there. You don't know if like, and everything, you dragged me into your schemes and your whatever. Like, he didn't choose to do this. Nobody's holding a gun to your head. You're following him around because you want to be part of this. So, and there's even the moment of, Kuni says, I can see the attraction of being emperor as, one of the semi-nude Facet veil dancers passed in front of him. And Rin says, stop talking like that. Do you want to go to jail? Kuni had a habit of saying outrageous things that could easily be interpreted as treason. This is the kind of thing that I really like, that makes me think about time travel movies and how going back in time is something that like people behave as if, oh, well, you know, as long as you are conservative about how you behave, you'll be okay. I would completely underestimate how conservative I need to be, because saying something as really harmless as I see the attraction of being emperor and that being construed as treason. I feel the same way about like, when I read some of these stories about women being like accused of witchcraft and the absolute nothings that they said that got somebody suspicious of them, or things that people have said that were taken to be like blasphemous, which I would be so screwed. And this scene, like the two of them are unwittingly right in the way of the assassin. So here comes this. I'm going to read again. This is one sentence, and I have this highlighted. I'll talk about the assassin in a moment, but this is a description of the emperor and the crown that he's wearing. All one sentence. Wrapped in a robe of shimmering silk, his crown a splendid creation of gold and glittering gems topped by the statuette of a Crubin, the scaled whale and lord of the four placid seas, whose single horn was made from the purest ivory at the heart of a young elephant's tusk, and whose eyes were formed by a pair of heavy black diamonds, the largest diamonds in all of Dara, taken from the treasury of Kukru when it had fallen to Zana 15 years earlier, Emperor Mapideri shaded his eyes with one hand and squinted at the approaching form of the great bird. Holy shit, Ken. Grab a period. That's all I'm saying. Here and there, it's necessary to end a sentence and start a new one. Don't be afraid of that, Ken. It's okay. Embrace it. You have too many thoughts happening in there to justify that. There's like not even that many, there's not even that many commas. It's like one, Jesus Christ. There's literally one comma in that whole thing and then some hyphens in the middle. Nope, sorry, 2 commas, my bad. Too much. And this is the kind of thing that I was reading it and my brain was starting to like, I could feel the smoke coming out of my ears because I was just like, oh my God, when is the end of this sentence? I need a moment to absorb this. You're giving me so much description here. You're telling me about like the Crubin, a scaled whale and lord of the 4 placid seas. Right there. That's a lot. Okay? And then the single horn was made from the purest ivory at the heart of a young elephant's tusks. Again, that's a pretty deep description. Whose eyes were formed by a pair of heavy black diamonds, the largest diamonds in all of Dara, taken from the treasury of Kukru when it had fallen to Zana 15 years earlier. You're giving me so much information right here. Just add some periods and make it easier for me to absorb. That's all I'm saying. So that was like, for me, out of these first 2 chapters, that was the worst offender. That being just one sentence is just, there's no reason for it at all. So the Emperor, who is super bored, doesn't really react to this person coming at him, because we find out basically this guy's like on a hang glider type of like Leonardo da Vinci winged, like clockwork type thing, and is heading for the Emperor because nobody is going to be anticipating an air attack because there's tons of airships around. So this dude, looking like a bird, really catches everybody off guard initially. And the Emperor is so bored that at first when he sees it, rather than like be alarmed by it, he's like, oh, here's something new and different. I've been super bored. What's that thing? When they realize that there's a man attached to it, he still doesn't really react the way that he should. He just says, interesting. So finally, the Imperial guards react and point their arrows, but do not actually shoot at this man, which I feel really like hammers home exactly what the climate is right now. It's been long enough that nobody is worried about the Emperor at this point. And it really doesn't seem like they need to be. Like, the way that everybody is acting in the streets indicates to me that it's water under the bridge to most folks. They don't really feel like fighting anymore, and they're not interested in like resisting. They're going to make the best of what they've got because this is what they've got. And so this dude appearing here, I am going to hazard a guess that this is the first time that anybody's made an attempt on the Emperor's life in a while. Because it doesn't even seem to occur to the Emperor that that could be what's happening right now. He doesn't have that kind of paranoia that you would expect of somebody who had just finished conquering and feels that there are still enemies all around them. Does that make sense? So they don't fire on this dude. And I love this. The strange gliding contraption was now only a few hundred yards away. The man hanging from the kite pulled on a few ropes dangling near him. The kite bird suddenly folded its wings and dove at the throne pagoda, covering the remaining distance in a few heartbeats. The man ululated. Ululated? Am I ululated? I actually don't think I've ever said that word out loud. A long, piercing cry that made the crowd below shiver despite the heat. Death to Xana and Mapidere! Long live the great Han! Before anyone could react, the kite rider launched a ball of fire at the throne pagoda. The Emperor stared at the impending missile, too stunned to move. Emperor, buddy, you need to wake up. Gotta get your coffee in the morning or something. Be a little bit more prepared for this shit. And the captain winds up pushing the Emperor out of the way and saving the Emperor's life, and almost gets burned up. Like, I think he gets hit with some of this because it's essentially sort of napalm. The unfortunate dancers and soldiers screamed as the sticky, burning liquid adhered to their bodies and faces, and flaming tongues instantly engulfed them. That's pretty fucked up. Like, and I'm pretty sure that this person who made the attempt is gonna feel some kind of way about the fact that they not only failed to assassinate the Emperor, but also killed innocent people. I would like to think that they are going to feel pretty bad about that. We'll see how it goes. So they fire their arrows at the assassin finally after a minute. And it's not like a reaction to what he did. They wait to fire until the captain tells them to. And there's a moment where the captain is just so irritated that he appreciates that these dudes are well trained and are not going to fire without a direct order, but also use your fucking common sense, guys. Somebody literally just tried to kill the Emperor. Maybe now's the time. And the assassin almost gets got. Some arrows go through the wings, and I think he's wearing like this leather armor, so the arrows just kind of ping off him. But he doesn't wind up going down, which when the arrows pierce the wings, I really thought that was going to be it. Not so. Meanwhile, poor Rin and Kuni are trying to avoid the raining fire that's coming down because the assassin circled and tried again. Two more times, I think. There were 3 attempts total. Finally realized that he couldn't do it and got away. So there's still splattering napalm, and then there's also all of the arrows that the soldiers fired into the air turning around and returning back to Earth, obviously super dangerously. So there's a lot going on, and these are 2 young kids that they have to figure out how to not die. And Kuni manages to find a shield that somebody dropped and uses it to protect himself and his friend. And he really is serious about it because once they're safe and he lifts the shield away, it's Rin sees that Kuni has burns on his back. And it's not terrible, but that shit's painful. Anybody who's been burned knows burns are probably one of the number 1 injuries pain-wise. It's excruciating. And this is a burn bad enough that it's bleeding, which that's a whole other kind of that's combo burn and acid when it eats into your skin enough to cause bleeding like that. That's fucked up. So yeah, he saw the smoke rising from Kuni's clothes. He yelped and hurried over, helping to extinguish the flames by slapping at Kuni's voluminous robes with his long sleeves. If you weren't on top of me, Rin swallowed. Kunigaru, you're a real friend. I think nothing of it, said Kuni. As Sage Konfiji said, one should always be ready to stick knives between one's ribs if that would help a friend. I love this because he says, see, Master Loing did teach me something. That's the part you remember? But that wasn't Konfiji. You're quoting from a bandit debating Konfiji. Who says bandits don't have virtues too? I love that little detail that he's oh, see, I heard this one thing that really stuck with me, and it turns out to be from somebody very disreputable. So yeah, this whole attempt is so wild though. Imagine trying to kill an emperor alone with a leg operated hang glider. Just that's a hell of a ballsy scheme. And the fact that he failed but managed to get away is really impressive. It just is. It's straight up impressive. So let's see. He'd seen the rider was a young man, not even 30. This is Kuni looking up. He had the dark skin and long limbs common to the men of Han up north. For a fraction of a second, the rider, looking down, had locked gazes with Kuni, and Kuni's heart thrilled with the fervent passion and purposeful intensity in those bright green eyes. He made the Emperor afraid, Kuni said, as if to himself. The Emperor is just a man after all. A wide smile broke on his face. And the Emperor is really mad because this isn't the first time that anybody's attempted, and we aren't given a specific timetable, but I'm really willing to bet that it has been a little bit. And also, the fact that this dude came closer than anybody, and I don't know if it's anybody period or just anybody in recent memory, but yeah, it's bad. This was just a huge oversight on the half of the, how do you say that? Huge oversight on behalf of, is that the one I want to say? I totally lost how to speak, everyone. I'm sorry, it's gone. On behalf of the captain. So captain is a little bit worried that he's going to wind up losing his job when we go into his head for a minute. And this chapter ends with, find that man, even if you have to tear apart every house in Zudi and burn down the estates of all the nobles in Han, bring him before me. So, chapter 2, Mata Zindu. Now, This is the opening where it gives you the place and time. Faroon in the Tunoa Islands, the 9th month in the 14th year of the reign of one bright heaven. Few would have guessed that the man towering above the noisy crowd at the edge of the town square of Faroon was only a boy of 14. The jostling townspeople kept a respectful distance from Mata Zindu's 7.5-foot frame. I don't know that I have ever met in person anybody of that size. 7.5 feet feels like the kind of size that just doesn't, you're no longer human anymore. Something else is going on. You've got some alien blood in you. You've got some fairy blood, giant blood. I don't know. But that's humongous. And not only is he huge, but he has 2 pupils to each eye that glow a little bit. How crazy. Like, this is the sort of thing that I want to see on the big screen, because I don't think my brain can adequately project a mental image that is as creepy as I bet this dude actually looks. What? And when they glow, like, how do they glow? Like, what color is the glow? Is the glow black like a regular pupil? How does black glow? Does that happen? What? I have so many questions about this. Those double-pupiled eyes allowed him to see more sharply and farther than most people, which we find out later is not always the case. Usually if you wind up with 2 pupils, it means that you're blind. So this can happen, seeing really well, but it's not the norm. He lingered on the slender, dark tower of stone to the north just outside of town. It stood next to the sea like a dagger stuck into the rocky beach. Mata could just make out the great arched windows near the top of the tower, whose frames were intricately decorated with carvings of the 2 ravens, black and white, their beaks meeting at the apex of the arch to hold up a stone chrysanthemum with 1,000 petals. That was the main tower of the ancestral castle of the Zindu clan. Of the Ziyundu. These days it belonged to Datun Zatoma, commander of the Zana garrison guarding Faroon. Mata Zindu hated to think about that commoner, not even a warrior, but a mere scribe, squatting in the ancient storied halls that rightfully belonged to his family. So again, with like a lot of dropping of names and places and the whole thing here, which it becomes a little bit clearer later. And they're really, when you are setting things up, there's not really a way to avoid that sort of info dump that, your audience may not yet understand. So I'm not even criticizing this. It's just acknowledging that there's a lot to absorb here. So he's waiting. He's also about to watch one of these processions. And when he gets a look at the emperor, he's really surprised because he thinks that this is going to be some fat old dude who's just like soft and doesn't care. But instead, through the wall of soldiers, as through a veil, he saw a gaunt figure with hard, expressionless eyes. How alone he is, high above, in his peerless splendor, and how afraid. Finn and Mata looked at each other. Each saw in the other's eyes the same mixture of sorrow and smoldering hatred. Finn didn't have to speak aloud. Mata had heard from his uncle the same words every day of his life. Do not forget. So then we get the story. Back when Emperor Mapidere was still only the youngest king of Zana, back when the army of Zana routed the crumbling forces of the 6 states across land, sea, and sky, one man had stood in its way, Dazu Zindu, Duke of Tunoa and Marshal of Kokru. The Ziyundus came from a long line of great Kokru generals, but when Dazu was a young man, he was scrawny and sickly. So then follows a pretty great, sort of myth about how Dazu wants to train with Mito, who is a master swordsman, legendary. If you want to be the best, that's who you go to. And Mito is not interested. Mito has retired. Mito is over it. He wants to just live out his days in peace and have a nice evening, drinking some yak milk. I don't know. But Mito won't talk to him, tells him to get lost, and Dazu doesn't leave. He just kneels outside Mito's house for 10 days and 10 nights until Mito finally is like, fine, but instead of it being fine, I'll teach you to sword fight, it's fine, you can feed my cows. Which Dazu takes the job. He doesn't even like bitch about it. And he goes and, does a really good job with this, the way, like, he's taking pride in his work, even though it's not what he originally had wanted here. And then it says, when a new calf was born in the spring, Mito told Dazu to carry the baby animal back to his house for a weigh-in each day so that the calf's legs would not be injured by the sharp stones on the ground. This involved walking many miles. At first the trip was easy, but as the calf gained weight, the trip became more difficult. The calf is capable of walking quite well now, Dazu said. He never stumbles. But I told you to carry him back here, the teacher said. The first thing a soldier must learn is how to obey orders. Every day, the calf grew a little heavier, and every day, Dazu had to struggle a little harder. He would collapse exhausted when he finally got to the ranch, and the calf would bound out of his arms, glad to be able to walk on his own and stretch out. When winter rolled around again, Mito handed him a wooden sword and asked him to strike as hard as he could at the practice dummy. Dazu looked with distaste at the crude weapon with no edge, but he swung obediently. The wooden dummy fell in half, cut clean through. He looked at the sword in his hand with wonder. It's not the sword, his teacher said. Have you looked at yourself lately? He brought Dazu to stand in front of a brightly polished shield. The young man could hardly recognize his reflection. His shoulders filled the frame of the mirror. His arms and thighs were twice as thick as he remembered, and his chest bulged over his narrow waist. So he's swole as fuck, super strong, and because of all of this, now the weapon in his hand is going to be that much more damaging. And that's a pretty fun little myth. I actually really liked that. It's the kind of thing that, like, when you're reading it, you know that there's going to be some kind of twist at the end, but I honestly didn't think ahead too much to, like, figure out what it might be. So it was still a surprise by the time I got to the end. And Dazu winds up being basically, like, legendary in his time. Just cuts people down on the battlefield. He's got, like, really obedient troops who look up to him and so obey his every word. And when the Zana army tries to invade, his army and tactics are what keep them from being successful. But this is a really fun little detail to me, at least. So what they do is he fortifies forts and little areas around the city. And whenever the Zana troops try and cross past those, like, fortresses, they would come up from behind them and just cut them off so that there was no supplies coming from the towns back to the opposing army. And this, just doing this, completely weighs down the attack and ruins the plans that Zana has. And finally, the way that this goes, unable to prevail on the field, Tonyeti resorted to plots. He spread rumors in Karusa, the Kokru capital, of the ambition of Duke Zindu. Why does Duke Zindu not attack Zana but only hide behind stone walls? The Zana army is clearly no match for the might of Kokru, and yet the Duke hesitates and leaves the invaders occupying our fields. Perhaps the Duke has a secret agreement with Gotha Tonyeti, and Tonyeti is only pretending to be attacking. Could they be plotting to overthrow the king and set up Duke Zindu as his replacement? So This makes the king so suspicious that he decides to force Zindu to go out into open battle, which, spoiler alert, is a real bad idea, which is why the Duke didn't do it in the first place, and they wind up getting completely spanked because he's tricked into pursuing Tanyeti until all of a sudden this enormous delegation that was like hidden in the forest comes out and ambushes. So this is the part where I'm like, this is the one piece of evidence I have so far of how garbage Zana is in the way that they deal with people. Dazu's Zindu negotiated for the safety of his soldiers as war prisoners and then took his own life, unable to live with the shame of capitulation. Gotha Tanyeti reneged on his promise and buried alive all the surrendered Kakru soldiers, which is bananas. Let's just, okay, you know, if you listen to my show, how big I am on logistics of things. That's always been something that fascinates me. Now let's talk about the logistics of burying that many surrendered soldiers. How many do you think that is? Let's say even that it's only like 60 people. And I'm sure it's more than that. Even just 60 people. Burying them alive, that's just such an undertaking. That just feels like you purposely did something that is an enormous pain in the ass to do just to make your point. They could have just tied rocks to him and all drowned them all. But no, buried alive. Wow. Dramatic much? Sorry, Kyle, I'm just seeing it's a condensed 80s sports montage. Oh my God, the myth. Yes, it is. There's going to be a good amount of logistics in this book. Yes. Maybe some people don't like that, but I like that. Mapideri decided to make an example of the Zindu clan who had resisted him for so long. Every male Zindu within 3 degrees of relatedness was put to death, and all the women sold to the indigo houses, which I had forgotten. Like, when I read indigo houses, I assumed initially that was like brothels or something, but then I realized that there's like huge warehouses to dye fabric, basically. So yeah, that's probably where. And Zindu's oldest son, Shiru, was flayed alive in Karuza, while Tanyeti's men forced the capital citizens to watch and eat bits of his flesh afterward to confirm their loyalty to Zana. Again, what? Like, that's just so insane. It's just such a crazy thing to do. Okay. Dazu's daughter, Soto, barricaded herself and her servants in their country estate and set fire to it to escape the worst fate that awaited her. The flames raged for a full day and night, as though the goddess Kana was expressing her grief, and the heat was so intense that even Soto's bones could not be found afterward in the wreckage. I maintain that Soto ain't dead. Just saying that. No body, ain't dead. That's how I roll. Soto's going to turn up at some point. Bones couldn't be found? Soto out there. Dazu's youngest son, 13-year-old Finn, evaded capture for days by hiding in the maze of lightless storage rooms. Spoiler alert, he gets caught. And he's too pathetic, having hidden the way that he did, for Tanyeti to even, want to kill him. He's like, killing you would just be shameful. So I'm going to treat you just like your brother's baby because you behave the same. Against Mapideri's orders, Tanyeti had spared Shiru's newborn son from slaughter. Nobles have to behave better than peasants, he had said, even in war. How is that behaving better than peasants when you're burying people alive after you just promised to treat them as prisoners? You're real inconsistent, Tanyeti. That feels a little bit too convenient for the sake of this story so that this kid winds up alive when he really wouldn't. But okay, fine. So Finn winds up raising Mata, and teaching Mata, like, basically, it's like toxic masculinity 101. So, Mata is just, this is what Finn is thinking to himself about raising Mata. He would make his heart cold and his blood hot, like icy Rappa and fiery Kana. For the sake of Mata, he would learn to become hard and sharp, instead of pampered and soft. In vengeance, even a rabbit can learn to become a wolf. Not really, but okay. Finn had to rely on occasional handouts from loyalist families, and then he finally, kills some thieves and just takes their shit, which, alright, you know what? I don't know about these thieves. Maybe that's fine. I really like that there's talk about the first time he shot a deer, he vomited at the sight of blood. The first time he swung a sword, he almost cut off his own foot. And then there's a paragraph a little later, Dazu and Shiru had not wanted the delicate Finn to follow the path of war. They had indulged Finn's love of literature and art, and look where that had gotten him. In a moment when the family needed him, Finn had been powerless, had been a coward who brought shame to the family name. So this is a real different take, because usually when you're reading this kind of story and there's a kid who's very intellectual, prefers reading and art and whatever to fighting, they're treated as like a black sheep. Whoa, he's not even a man, yada, yada, yada. And the kid himself is like, I am so a man, I'm just different, and why can't you guys just understand me? And this is a situation in which his family did understand him. And his family was like, oh, no, you are not going to be out waging war. That is not for you, my friend. You go up to your room and read your book, and you have a nice time while your brother goes out and wages war. And he gets exactly what he wanted. But it turns out to have been his undoing in some ways. Now, one could argue that as much as he brought shame to the family name, if he had been a fighter, he would be dead, and so would the baby. Or at least the baby would have been raised by somebody from Zana, and so would not have turned out anything like what Mata is like now. So if he could fight, I understand him looking back and regretting how he had this really soft, luxurious life, but you were a kid and you weren't fighting was the fact that you weren't a threat is what saved your life, which I know seems shameful to you, but it winds up paving the way for potential vengeance at some point, which is a pretty big deal. So, maybe you have some shame surrounding that, but also don't just discount that. Okay. He gave Mata a childhood that he thought they would have wanted. Whenever Mata hurt himself, as all children did, Finn forced himself to refuse the boy any comfort until Mata learned that crying was useless. Whenever Mata fought with another boy from the town, Finn insisted that he press on until he emerged victorious. Finn never tolerated signs of weakness in the child, and taught Mata to welcome every conflict as a chance to prove himself. And so at one point I think it says that Mata starts eating, he eats only meat and he bathes only in cold water. It's basically he's trying to live a Spartan life, and has really absorbed what he has been taught. And from these books and from his memory, Finn told Mata stories and legends of Kokru's martial past and of these Zindu clan's glorious history. Mata dreamed of emulating his grandfather to carry on the legacy of his prowess. Here it is. He ate only meat and bathed only in cold water. Having no living calf to carry, he volunteered to help the fishermen at the wharf unload their catch each day and earned a few coppers doing so. He filled small sacks with rocks and tied them around his wrists and ankles so that each step required more strength. If there were 2 paths to a destination, he picked the longer and more arduous one. If there were 2 ways to do something, he chose the harder and more strenuous method. By the time he was 12, he could lift the giant cauldron in front of the temple in Faerun over his head. So that's intense. And because of his dedication to this, he's got no friends. not a huge shock. Like, most kids are not going to be this focused, and they're going to, kids want to play. Kids want to, this is a kid that's been brainwashed a little bit. I feel like he's like one step from being an Unsullied. Like, I'm surprised his uncle didn't give him a puppy to kill. And it's really like, basically, he's being turned into a vengeful machine that's going to fuck shit up for everybody. And by everybody, I mean Zana, hopefully. Mappadiri's conquest has degraded the very foundations of the world, Finn told him time and time again. The origin of the old Tiro system was lost in the mists of time. Legend had it that the islands of Dara were settled long ago by a people who called themselves the Ano, refugees of a sunken continent far over the seas to the west. Once they had defeated the barbarians who were the original inhabitants of the islands, some of whom intermarried and became Ano themselves, they promptly fell to fighting. Their descendants over many generations and many wars separated into various states. So this is the general overview of the history of how these 7 states began. And they coexisted for over 1,000 years. But for that tyrant from Zana, they would have existed for 1,000 more. I really do want to know, like, how much money do you really need? I imagine being king of just one of these states, you're doing pretty well. How much better could it possibly be being king of all 7? Just settle, just like be cool, man. And there's some, shit here that I feel like is implied to be like, oh, isn't this awful, that I don't think is awful? So first, there's the wisdom of the Tiro system was evident in the way it reflected the natural world. In the ancient forests of Dara, each great tree, like a Tiro state, stood independent of the others. No tree held sway over another, yet each tree was made up of branches and each branch of leaves, just as each king drew his strength from his nobles and each noble from his peasantry. It was the same with the separate islands of Dara, each composed of islets and lagoons, of bays and coves. The pattern of independent realms, each composed from miniature copies, could be found in coral reefs, in schools of fish, in drifting forests of kelp, in mineral crystals, and in the anatomy of animals. It was the underlying order of the universe, a grid like the warp and weft of the rough cloth woven by the Kokru craftsman, formed by horizontal lines of mutual respect among equals, and vertical lines of downward obligation and upward fealty in which everyone knew his place. Instead of scholars for each Tiro state writing with their own sets of logograms and arranging the Zindari letters in their own fashion, bound up with local tradition and history, everyone now had to write in the manner of Zana. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I don't see a problem with imposing your history on somebody else. It's not what I'm saying. And this one, in losing local tradition and history, actually does make plenty of sense, and I have no problem with this one. This one, though, instead of each Tiro state determining its own system of weights and measures, its own way of judging and seeing the world, everyone now had to make their roads as wide as the distance between the wheels of a cart from the immaculate city, their boxes as big as could be packed tightly into a boat from the port of Krifi, the former Zana capital. And those things, like standardization of like the size of roads, I don't really see what's, like, even mentioning that feels so silly to me after the pretty good example of like losing your history and customs with your language. And so, like, the new orderly way of life was lost and no one knew his place. Commoners were living in castles while nobles huddled in drafty huts, which, again, knowing your place is one of those things that I would just inherently have a problem with that language. So this also doesn't seem like a bad thing to me. But Zana does seem to suck, so I'll give them that. And Finn says they cheer for a man who murdered their fathers and grandfathers. Mata looked around at the departing men and women. They were like the sand and mud stirred up by the ocean. If you scooped up a cup of seawater, it would be full of swirling chaos that obscured the light. But if you waited patiently, eventually the common dross and dregs would settle to the bottom where they belonged, and the clear water would allow the light through, the noble and pure. Mata Zindu believed it was his destiny to restore clarity and order. Now, this is dangerous in and of itself. The dross and dregs would settle to the bottom where they belonged. Not awesome. Not the kind of thought process and language that you want to hear from somebody that seems to be a hero, being set up to be the hero. So I'm real curious about Mata, restore clarity and order with the noble and pure. The weight of history pulled everything back down to its rightful place. Side-eyeing that. Really am. And I was right. That was plenty to fill an hour. There's a lot. Kyle, do you have any questions for me before I wrap this up? Yeah, but I like the ending of that, because Mata, he really does seem to be oh, here comes the Hercules of the book, here he comes to save the day. And he's actually seems to be very classist and knowing your place. I really feel like that's got to be no good for women in his life, because I'm sure a woman's place is not particularly elevated. So yeah, I'm not really sure how I feel about this guy yet, because this could just be a manner of speech. And then when you find out what he really believes, it doesn't feel like what it sounds like here. Yeah, so we'll see about that. All right, Kyle does not have any questions. So I just want to thank you all very much for listening and for supporting the show. If you're interested in commissioning something, you can go to unspoiledpodcast.com/shop. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.